Good afternoon or good evening, and maybe even good morning to all who have been able to join us in this promising and I'm sure most interesting discussion under the auspices of the Brazilian Center for International Relations, our own CEBRI. Global and regional trade have always been one of the focuses of CEBRI's work, so it seems timely and appropriate that we should take time to exchange views and insights on the ever-relevant topic of the future of trade in a world which is struggling in the face of a COVID-19 pandemic and can only be driven toward overall growth by means of cooperation and commitment. Thanks to my good friend and colleague, Victor do Prado, Director of Council and Trade Negotiations Committee at the WTO, now also a Senior Fellow of CEBRI, we have the honor and the pleasure to gather on this occasion three of the most distinguished experts in international trade. And I'm referring here to former Minister of Trade of Costa Rica, Anabel Gonzalez, the President of the National Foreign Trade Council of the United States, Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, and the Professor of International Trade and Economic Development at the University of St. Gallen, Simon Evanet. Victor, who will serve as moderator in this event, may wish to make a proper introduction of our invitees. I know that he'll do that. Meanwhile, just allow me to express my sincere gratitude to all three of them for making themselves available to be here today. I had not had the satisfaction to meet Professor Evanet until now, but I have known and learned to admire the work done by both Anabel and Rufus in the 80s and in the 90s when they represented their countries in different negotiating fora and made bona fide contributions to both the multilateral and the regional processes. We are fortunate to listen to their remarks and comments on the issue at hand. Allow me also to preface Victor's introduction by stressing the relevance of trade growth in any effort to revert the damage caused to lives and health of people around the world. Regardless of the general directions in which the exchange of goods and services will turn or are already turning, it is crucial that 1, market access be increased, 2, protectionist pressures be resisted, 3, politicization of trade is checked, and 4, national governments develop policies to use trade as a means to eliminate poverty and reduce inequalities. After the Uruguay round was successfully concluded, members of WTO had opportunities to reduce costs of trade and investments, and some institutional progress was achieved when preferential arrangements attempted to achieve WTO objectives on a regional basis. Moreover, when the WTO's dispute settlement system was in full swing, panels issued reports and an impartial and independent appellate body gave, as appropriate, decisive interpretations of the multilaterally agreed rules. Come 2020, the well-known challenges accumulate and the national economies are confronted with fiscal difficulties, high rates of unemployment, significant declines in GDP. And yet, for middle and high-income consumers, it has been basically business as usual, as the production as well as the purchase and flow of goods and services have allowed them to directly satisfy their needs and desires. In other words, the markets were not disrupted. Trade in some sectors have even grown, so that the utmost priority remains that of saving lives and combat the pandemic at whatever cost. We all look forward, of course, to a brighter future, one in which cooperation, solidarity, and rationality may prevail over geopolitics, discrimination, unilateralism, and power disputes. Thanks again to all online for your time and your attention. Over to you, Victor.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Graça Lima, Carlos Alfredo, and a warm welcome to all our guests and participants. As you suggested, Alfredo, I would like to add to the brief introduction you have already made of our guests. And I'll start with Ambassador Rufus Yerxa, who, as you said, is the current president of the National Foreign Trade Council, the NFTC. Ambassador Yerxa has more than 4 decades of experience as a lawyer, diplomat, US trade negotiator, and international official. Notably, Ambassador Yerxa was the United States permanent representative in Geneva during the final stages and the conclusion of the Uruguay round, which I guess makes him one of the founding fathers of the WTO. Ambassador Yerxa spent several years also in private law practice and in the corporate world. He was later Deputy Director General of the WTO from 2002 to 2013, a total of 11 years, the longest serving WTO Deputy Director General. Today, Ambassador Yerxa will be focusing on prospects of the incoming Biden administration in international trade affairs. Rufus, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. We're honored to have you here. And if I may, I will introduce our other guests so that you all go from one to the other. We are also very pleased to have with us Minister Anabel Gonzalez, currently Senior Fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. She was previously a Senior Director at the World Bank Trade and Competitiveness Global Practice from 2010 to 2014. Anabel was the Trade Minister of Costa Rica. She was also Ambassador and Chief Negotiator for the Free Trade Agreement between Central America and the United States. And last but not least, Anabel also worked as a Director of Agriculture Division in the WTO. Anabel, I must say, hosts a Trade Wins virtual event at the Peterson Institute. And this is really an unmissable series of online events. And I would encourage everyone who has an interest for international trade to follow the Trade Wins. If I'm not mistaken, the next one is on the 16th of December on revitalizing multilateralism, and I'll come back to revitalizing multilateralism in a minute. Anabel will be expanding on the main traits of international trade, especially in times of COVID. Thank you very much for sparing the time, Anabel. Really a pleasure to have you here. And I'm equally pleased to introduce Professor Simon Evenet, who is a professor of international trade and economic development and MBA director at the University of St. Gallen here in Switzerland. Professor Evenet specializes in how governments tilt the commercial playing field in favor of local firms. At the start of the financial crisis back in 2008, 2009, Professor Evenet created the Global Trade Alert Initiative. And this is one of the leading independent monitor of protectionism and commercial policy choice, and it's based at the University of St. Gallen. Professor Evenet has made an important contribution to the academic literature on international trade with several books published, and he recently co-edited an ebook under the title, and I come back to this, Revitalizing Multilateralism. And Professor Evenet may say a word about his ebook. He will speak about trade restrictions and government measures, a topic in which he excels. Simon, thank you very much for being with us in spite of the late hour here in Geneva. Really much appreciated. So we will have initial remarks of our guests for about 10 minutes each. Then we'll provide an opportunity to participants to make comments, ask questions, and please send your questions to the chat function if you wish to make one. Let me take an opportunity also to thank all who have logged in today. I see many friends and distinguished persons amongst the participants. I'm sure José Alfredo joins me in expressing our appreciation for the participation of all. And please stay tuned on CEBRI. There are very interesting events being organized in different areas, and we plan to continue discussing international trade issues. So without further ado, let me turn to Ambassador Yerxa for his presentation. Rufus, over to you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Can you all hear me all right? Good. First of all, let me express my appreciation to you and to CEBRI for this opportunity. It's a great chance to reach an important audience. And of course, I want to express my appreciation to my former colleague and good friend, Ambassador Garcia Lima. Alfredo, probably you and I go too far back to want to admit it to people about exactly how far we go back, but it's great to be here with you and to see the work you're continuing to do. Really one of the great leaders in economic diplomacy in the Brazilian system. And of course, my two great friends and former colleagues in the Secretariat, Annabelle and Victor, really two of the best WTO experts in the whole system. And it's great to have a chance to be with you. I look forward to hearing your presentation, Annabelle. And of course, to Simon Evanet, who, you know, gosh, who hasn't spent a lot of time following his whole trade alert system. And at the National Foreign Trade Council, where I now work, we spend a lot of time retweeting a lot of his hard work. So we want to thank him for that and for all the work he's doing to give transparency to what governments around the world are doing in the trade space. Victor, you asked me to talk a little bit about, you know, obviously this important transition that's occurring in the American system and what that might mean in terms of global trade and U.S. trade policy and our interaction with all our trading partners. I suppose maybe a good starting point is to acknowledge, you know, that we are living through one of the darkest and toughest years in post-war history, which is affecting both governments and, more importantly, people and citizens of all of our countries. And it's a huge challenge to try to cope with all of that, and yet at the same time try to maintain some semblance of order in the international trading system and convince people that keeping trade working is going to be an important part of the recovery. I think we're all, you know, very hopeful and thrilled that we start to see light at the end of the tunnel as a vaccine starts to move around the world, which in and of itself presents a big global challenge. And I know, Annabelle, you may talk about some of that in your presentation. Certainly, we're doing some work at NFTC about the challenges there will be in getting a vaccine distributed. And we're doing an event in January on that very subject. But I guess I should start with sort of, you know, what is the impact of this change of leadership in the US and what will we see as a sort of a new direction in trade policy? Spend a few minutes on that. You know, I'd sort of say the best way to describe the 2020 election is maybe it was a little bit of a buyer's remorse election. You know, you know, Americans had sort of been driving a zippy sports car during the Obama administration, and then they decided they wanted a big, powerful Ford F-150 truck. And now maybe in 2020, they've had a little remorse about that decision and they're looking for a different vehicle to drive. But you know, you never go back to what you had before. Probably now they're looking for a different kind of, you know, family sedan with different features and maybe some energy efficiency and other things. And in the trade space, it is clear that Biden as a candidate has been highly critical of a lot of the elements of the more mercantilist and even nationalistic trade policy that was deployed by the Trump administration, not necessarily criticizing all aspects of it. And there are areas where I think you'll see some similarities to past policies. You know, there was strong support on both sides of the political divide for renegotiation of the USMCA agreement, for example. There's strong support from both sides in a more shall we say, a more forceful attitude towards some of the policies and practices of China and China's emergence and how the trading system deals with China. But I think it's also clear to say that what we're seeing emerge in a new Biden team as he names his economic, national security and trade policy team is more of a focus on restoring U.S. leadership multilaterally, which certainly could be good news for working together in the WTO system, for reinvigorating U.S. support for the rule of law and for the importance of rules, not just of sort of tit for tat mercantilist policies, but also probably a big emphasis on climate change, for example, and that will have trade implications, something we should talk about as to how that will be coped with in the WTO and in the rest of the global architecture of rules. You know, and obviously also an emphasis on democracy and human rights and other elements. And importantly, in bilateral and regional deals on things like labor standards, which Democrats pushed hard for as an integral part of the new USMCA agreement. So we can talk about all those elements, some very interesting choices of people that are being picked, names that people will recognize, but who are not necessarily so much politicians as they are, you know, very experienced practitioners and policy people. I mean, Tony Blinken as Secretary of State, for example, Catherine Tai, who's just been named as the new U.S. Trade Representative, very interesting pick. Clearly someone who's going to put a lot of emphasis on trade law and the rule of law, and who also has a pretty good portfolio of experience when it comes to dealing with China. She's handled many big WTO disputes against China when she worked at USTR. She's fluent in Mandarin. I think she'll be a formidable negotiator in that respect. But I think also one who, you know, there's a good prospect that she can help Biden develop a more bipartisan approach to trade, and one which also will work on reinvigorating our traditional alliances around the world, getting away from some of our frictions with our best trading partners like Europe and our North American partners and Brazil and others. And so that bodes well for, you know, the US re-engaging actively in the WTO. What I would say about the WTO, though, is people have to be realistic about how this administration is going to approach it. I think, first of all, they will have a very strong emphasis on reform and on expanding the WTO rules to cover areas of great importance to the US. One of those areas is obviously the digital economy and e-commerce, which has become even more important in this pandemic era. And, you know, obviously those industries have grown tremendously, but it's also reflected some of the, shall we say, gaps and lacunae we have in the system of international agreements and rules to cope with the new elements of a digital economy. So I think they'll push hard on that. I think they will push hard in areas that involve Chinese practices and policies, state-owned enterprises and technology transfer and other things. And I think you will see them advocating a negotiating agenda that is relevant to the concerns that the US has about how state capitalism interacts with more free market forms of capitalism in the WTO system. And then, of course, you know, I should emphasize about COVID. I know Annabelle will talk more about that. You know, clearly the top priority of the Biden administration is going to be grappling with the pandemic. I think the people coming in this new administration are going to be of the view that you can't really successfully eradicate pandemics in the United States unless you eradicate them globally, and that means we need global cooperation and collaboration, both between governments and between governments and the private sector. If you look at this massive task of vaccine distribution, which involves big drug companies, how you ship and transport very, shall we say, fragile vaccines around the world, how you make sure that they're equitably distributed, how you deal with everything from the trade facilitation and customs barriers that we will run into, as well as rules on intellectual property and other things. So there's a big challenge in how we cope with the distribution. And then the very last thing I'll say, because of my time's up, is one of the issues in post-pandemic recovery obviously is going to be a lot of pressures for governments to subsidize their own industries, for the state to step in where economic activity in the private sector has been sort of flat on its back. And that is going to present a lot of challenges in the trading system. I think we will have some inevitable disputes about subsidy practices, about government procurement measures and other things. And of course, hopefully we'll be able to cope with it and, you know, to get away from some of the more highly nationalistic attitudes that have kind of governed the interactions between our governments over the last 4 years. I'll stop there, Victor. My 10 minutes is up, and I hope that was useful, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Rufus. Very useful indeed. I mean, I completely agree with you. Level playing field and subsidies will be a hot topic in the future. Over to you, Annabelle. Thank you very much again.
Thank you very much, Victor. And let me first start by thanking you and CEBRI for this kind invitation. I am delighted to be here with all of you. Thank you very much, Ambassador Graça Lima, also for your very inspirational words at the beginning of this event, and for all your hard work over the years in the area of international trade. I am also, of course, delighted to be here with my friends and former colleagues, Rufus and Simon. Fortunately, we continue to work together and participate in different panels on this topic. So thank you all very much, and of course to the participants. So Victor, you asked me to talk a little bit about trends in global trade after COVID-19, and will we go back to normal? So I had a short presentation because this is a tough topic. So I thought I'd rather use a couple of slides to help me go through the topic. So maybe let me just start very briefly by reminding all of us that the trade policy landscape before COVID-19 was already very challenging. We knew that with trade conflicts and new technologies and the geopolitical competition that were reshaping the global economy, three features characterized the trade and investment policy landscape: the revival of managed trade, greater fragmentation of trade rules, and weakening of global governance, including the use and abuse of national security, a topic that I know Rufus was very much paying attention to, the paralysis of the appellate body, and others. Complex concerns underpinned tensions in the system, including this issue about the level playing field to address market distorting state intervention in the economy and spillovers from that intervention, WTO rules to fit the global economy, and one issue, of course, that's been very relevant, and here Brazil has played an important role, is this discussion of what contribution of emerging economies to the system. So prospects were not good. The WTO was under significant strain. The business environment was uncertain, volatile, and increasingly power-driven, and global value chains had begun to readjust to take account of the policy environment. So then came COVID-19, and with it, of course, a significant global shock derived from the virus and from the lockdown and other measures that were put into place to try to mitigate the impact of the virus. So we had initially forced reduction in production in a number of places, steep decline in demand in some sectors, such as cars, for example. I was looking the other day at some numbers. So the demand for cars has gone down by over 70%. But at the same time, sharp increase in other products like medical gear. WHO had estimated, I think, earlier in March or April this year, that the demand had increased by 40% at that time for this product. We also had, of course, severe transportation disruptions and unprecedented business uncertainty. So the initial policy response of many governments was to rush to curb exports on medical gear, also a little bit on food, and I know that Simon will talk to this, also to facilitate trade. But in parallel to this trade policy actions, there was also a calls to reshore production and to restructure supply chains. And actually, a number of governments have put in place programs to that effect. So what has happened since the pandemic started earlier in the year? So one important thing is that the worst case scenario that was projected in April in terms of the evolution of world merchandise trade has been averted. You may remember that earlier in April this year, the WTO projected, based on the information at the time, that global trade could decline by between 12 or 13% to 32%. So fortunately, we are not there yet. Nevertheless, world merchandise trade is forecast to fall 9.2% in 2020, and trade volume growth should rebound to 7.2% in 2021, but will still remain below the pre-crisis trend. Now, interestingly, as I was saying, merchandise trade is slowly rebounding. Now, this, of course, it masks many differences across sectors and across products. Things like electronics have gone up, while other things, I was saying, like cars or clothing, for instance, have gone down. We have this measure that the WTO puts out in terms of the goods trade barometer, and the last one that was presented has a good reading of 100.7%, which basically shows an improvement in terms of merchandise trade that we can expect. While there was a strong rebound in trade in the third quarter, it is expected that growth is likely to slow in this fourth quarter as pent-up demand is exhausted and inventory restocking is completed. Now, on services, things, of course, are not looking that good. On the one hand, all the lockdown measures, but of course, the travel restrictions have impacted services that required movement of people. So we have a steep decline in services, exacerbated by these restrictions on international travel. World trade in merchandise, in commercial services, plunged by a record 30% year on year in the second quarter of 2020. And yet, despite the fact that we have begun to see a little bit of easing of international travel restrictions, the reality is that services trade will continue to be impacted. This the services trade barometer is the weakest on record. And it is true that some services, nevertheless, are showing some growth. And we think here, of course, of Zoom and similar services, cloud hosting services in the IT sector, and others. So a bit, I think, of a mixed panorama, and still on the negative, of course, on the negative side for 2020. Now, so the question is, the question is, well, now that we have the vaccine is coming out and there seems to be light at the end of the tunnel, post-pandemic, will trade come back to normal? So Rufus was asking, well, will things go back to the way they were before in the US, for example, with the new administration? And his response was no. And I think that is the same response, when you think about global trade. Think we'll go back to normal, but it will not be the same normal. And so I have both sort of 5 topics that I think can help us think, what will happen next. And maybe too early to tell, and certainly I don't have a definitive answer in each of the cases. But for example, one element that will drive global trade in the future will be, what will be the changes in the structure of demand. So for example, in advanced countries, Will people go back to the office exactly the same as they did before? Or will they stay and work from home, 2 or 3 days a week? Or for some people, maybe they stay at home most of the time. What will the implications be, for example, in terms of reduced demand for cars and for gasoline, or we may have less demand for office space, for example, less demand for clothes, and all of this will put a lot of pressure into value chains, and this, of course, will reflect itself on the future of trade. Will tourism fully recover? This has been very impactful for many countries, both advanced countries and developing countries alike. So, can we expect that as soon as everyone is vaccinated, tourism will go back again to normal? Not clear, but maybe other services will be in greater demand. So, these changes in the structure of demand will likely have a significant impact on the future of trade. Again, another element is the acceleration of automation and digitalization. So we know, for instance, that in the course of the pandemic, a lot of robots were deployed, for instance, for cleaning hospitals because to avoid human contact and the potential for contagion. So will robots become a more cost-effective choice to manage risk, for example? Will digital cross-border services substitute trading goods or services that require physical presence? Again, all these are questions that are sort of evolving as we speak. Then we have the geopolitical competition that was there before and hasn't gone away. And how will the structural differences between the U.S. and China be addressed? And I think that there's a lot of hope in the world with the incoming administration in the US. But as Rufus was saying, I mean, there are some structural issues there that will need tackling, and this is not going to be easy. It's not going to be quick either. So, how will this impact the future of trade? I think this will be something that we will be, paying a close look at. And of course, the new phase of protectionism, if we might call it that way, what traction for this kind of renewed strategic industrial policies, and how would they be implemented? I know that Simon has been doing a lot of work in the area of subsidies. What will this imply for the future of trade? And then, of course, another big dimension here is this sort of overlap between trade, technology, and security, and how will this continue to evolve? How will it be addressed? And again, what impact will it have on the future trade landscape? And last but not least is, the question of sustainability. Will all the recovery programs that are being put in place in advanced economies in particular, would they lead to a more sustainable world? We see that a number of these programs are linked to sustainability criteria. So how will this impact trade? So these are all of them, each of these are very important questions. And I don't think that we have an answer to any of them, but depending on how, on what that answer ends up being, I think that we will see the trade policy landscape and trade itself moving in one direction or another. So very quickly, just about a year and a half ago, I'm part of a council at the World Economic Forum. When we were part of that council, Victor was there, and with another colleague, Yeling Tan, we developed 4 scenarios for the future of trade, based on whether it would be, high ease of trade or low ease of trade, and whether countries would move more towards unilateral action or towards trade cooperation. And so we came up with sort of like headlines for each of them. And, at that time we had here open international rules, competing coalitions, sovereignty first, and technological disruption. So I think for 2019, most of 2019 and 2020, we were closer to the lower left quadrant. So to me, the question is, will we be moving more from here, to here, to the upper right quadrant? And I sure hope so. But we will see, I guess, in the course of next year. And just to conclude very quickly, because I have been making my my points about what I think should be the key priorities for the next WTO Director General, and I wanted to bring them here because I think Rufus referred to a number of them. So I think that there are 5 key priorities in going forward. The first is to promote the positive role of trade in fighting COVID-19 and ensuring resilience in future health crises. The second is to foster a COVID-19 related agreement on medical supplies and vaccines, which I think is absolutely critical. The third is to facilitate the creation of a lasting solution to the appellate body crisis. The fourth is to fast track negotiations to reach an agreement on digital trade. And the fifth one is to stimulate a WTO discussion on this issue of subsidies that has been mentioned by Rufus and by Victor. And I always say it's 5+1 because I come back to this point that I think with the new administration in the US, there will be a great opportunity to further develop a trade and environment agenda. And the fishery subsidies, of course, negotiations should be a place to start here. So with this, Victor, let me conclude, and again, thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Annabelle, including for all those relevant questions. And I'm happy to see that the quadrants that we discussed in the World Economic Forum Global Futures Council remains relevant, although we're not in the quadrant that we wish to be. Simon, over to you, and thank you again, in spite of the late hour here in Geneva. Thank you.
Thank you, Victor. And I must say thank you also to CEBRI for this invitation. I understand you're ramping up your work in trade policy, and I think that's terrific. And I think now we have all these webinars, the ability to be able to have global reach in this is a real opportunity to further strengthen Brazil's profile on trade policy, both nationally, regionally, and globally. I also want to say it's great to be back on a panel with Annabelle and Rufus, and I'm going to shamelessly build on them, their presentations, so I don't have to repeat all the same points. So although I'm going to speak a lot more about what's happened this year and what could happen next year as we have a new Director General in place and with a newer US administration, please don't forget the important points which my colleagues have made, and I think the important contextual points, and that is that first, a WTO which has nothing to say about the digital economy or very little to say about e-commerce is a WTO which is not going to be seen to be very relevant to more and more business, and that would be a huge pity. Secondly, with COP26 coming up, there is going to be a lot more senior policy makers' attention on climate change and then transition to a low carbon economy. And these are really important global imperatives, which I believe the trade policy community through the WTO should be having something to say about. Annabelle also raised the reality of the global geopolitical competition and the increasing role of national security. And these are important contextual factors which are not going to go away. One other one which I will repeat as a theme of mine is that although we're coping with the current pandemic, we are still also coping with the legacy of the last global economic crisis. And it is a sort of depressing fact that of the 1,400 or so trade distortions which were imposed in 2009, over half of them are still in effect today. And that strongly suggests that there is what I call long-term scarring of the world trading system. We do not have a system which is reverting back to where it was before the crisis. And I'll come back to that theme because I think we need to realize that this system is not self-correcting, and that's something we need to realize. Okay, let me turn now to what has happened this year. As Annabelle said, there was a lot of action in medical goods, less in food, but in medical goods, there was a lot of action at the beginning of the year. I must say, to be balanced and fair about this, at least according to the records we have, we saw about 194 trade reforms by governments imposed in the run-up to the middle part of this year. And this was good news, freeing up trade. And that was valuable. Just remember that before the pandemic hit, 141 countries taxed imports of soap, which at a time of a pandemic like this, coronavirus, is absolutely nuts. And I'm happy to say that a lot of those taxes were removed, at least temporarily. Now, we are seeing some phase out in those trade reforms in the area of medical goods. And by the end of this year, we'll be down to only 124 of those trade reforms being in place. At least according to the phase-out dates which have been announced, around 100 of them will be in place by the end of next year. So there could well be a long-term opening of that, or medium-term opening of that sector, but that has to be balanced against the fact that we saw a huge run-up in the number of trade restrictions imposed in the area of medical goods, mainly in the form of export curbs, rising to a total of 145 imposed by April 2020. That number is now falling. We're down to about 109 in force, which are still in force now. But even by the end of next year, we'll have 68, which will not have been removed. So there is a real potential here for long-term scarring in that particular sector. And that's a source of concern. We've already heard proposals for a memorandum of understanding and then ultimately perhaps a plurilateral or multilateral liberalizing medical goods trades, and I would certainly endorse this. I think it makes no sense to tax these items. This will also be, I think, important as we come into the vaccine distribution phase. I was depressed when I checked this morning the WTO tariff download facility to see that there are 28 countries around the world which still tax the importation of vaccines, human vaccines. 2 countries have 10% tariffs on them. That's India and Congo. And we even have 2 jurisdictions this year which have raised the tariffs on imported human vaccines, which surely is a step in the wrong direction. So we've got work to do there for next year as well. And I think medical goods is getting that right is one of the good ways in which we can demonstrate to senior policymakers that the WTO can make a positive contribution at a time like this. When you look more broadly at the policy response this year, you, in addition to seeing lots of trade reforms, you do indeed see lots and lots of trade distorting subsidies. Now, in the work that my team does, we do not count every subsidy we see. For example, paying a company to pay their staff to stay at home is, I don't think, too much of a problem from a trade distortions point of view because the company's not producing. Okay, so if you take out all of those subsidies, there's still a huge number of subsidies to firms that face import competition and also incentives to firms to export, which have been put in place this year. Overall, we estimate that the trade reforms this year cover about 9.1% of goods trade, and the trade distortions this year cover over 13% of world goods trade. And so the balance is in the wrong direction, but I think a key goal will be to try and unwind as much as we can those trade distortions. Now, beyond the global averages, there's one other really important finding that we looked at when we looked carefully at the G20. There's a huge variation across the G20 this year in both the volume of their policy responses which affect trade and in the mix between harmful measures and liberalizing measures. And this for me leads to a very important question. And that is, in a pandemic, we want to have states which are effective. We definitely want that. But we also want, ideally, in such a globalized world, we want to have states which can take effective action at the least possible harm to their trading partners. And since this year, we've seen such huge variation across the major trading powers in the policy mixes that they've used, then maybe we should, once this is all settled down, look at that experience and ask, are there better practices that we can advise governments in future crises whereby they can take effective action against whatever is the social threat, but try not to create so much harm to trading partners? Because it's clear this year that governments did not follow a single blueprint. And some of the policy steps taken will be more harmful than others. And I think what we need to be doing is rethinking how we approach crises. The classic WTO way of doing this at the moment is to invoke Article 20 of the GATT and just say it's a crisis, governments can do whatever they like within, by and large. Let's just put it that bluntly like this. And the question I think we need to be asking ourselves in such a globalized world, how can we channel crisis response in a way which is both effective as well as limiting the harm to trading partners? I think that's a big picture question we should be returning to. Now, Victor was kind enough to mention the book that Richard Baldwin and I co-edited on revising multilateralism. In the introduction to that book, we make the case that the current system is facing an enormous number of strains and pressures, that I think there's a general sense that the current situation cannot persist. And I think we need to therefore take confidence building measures in the short term, but perhaps over the medium term, come back to the fundamental question: what is the purpose of the WTO? What do we want this organization to accomplish? Where do we want it to be 10 years from now? That's different from asking the question that the Saudis asked in the Riyadh process, which was to turn around and say, what principles can we agree on? I'm more interested in finding what's the common denominator of where this organization needs to go. Are we interested in promoting integration? Are we interested in promoting market economies? Are we interested in reducing uncertainty? Are we interested in better managing crises? We need to have a discussion about those imperatives. But to get there, first, we have to do confidence building measures. And I have 5 very short ideas in this respect, which I'll share with you. The first is that the WTO Secretariat, in fact, the new Director General, I think needs to establish a crisis management protocol for how this organization deals with crises when they happen, ramping up their transparency function in areas where there should be short-term cooperation between states, such as everyone agreeing to eliminate their tariffs on soap and on vaccines. We need to have in place a mechanism whereby MOUs can be signed by members who are willing to do them. And of course, there's the operational questions this time round, how to maintain meetings in virtual formats. So there's an operational side there too. So the first sort of confidence building measure is to show that this organization can better react to crises and faster. A second measure has got to relate to the coming issue of distributing and producing large enough vaccines. And there's, I think, should probably be a working group looking at the trade-related aspects of vaccine production and distribution. This could look at whether or not the TRIPS agreement needs to be modified, and of course deal with the sticky questions of the waiver, which has been proposed by India and South Africa. We should also be looking at whether the trade facilitation agreement needs to be revised in light of the need to distribute vaccines, or at least needs to be modified its application in the near term. And I think the other big area we have to look into is the potential for holdups next year, when governments may try and to stop the exports of vaccines or the ingredients for vaccines, so as to either look after their domestic populations or to secure more vaccine supplies from producers. And I think that's a real risk that we face and would have to be addressed. The third area is to look at how we can get trade flowing again, and how can we encourage governments to reduce the port restrictions and the airport restrictions which exist. There are a large number of them. We document them in the book. This is not a traditional area for WTO action, but it implicates very severely the world trading system, and it's an area where I think the WTO should be pointing the spotlight and encouraging governments to think again about their policies. The fourth area, which builds very naturally from the discussion we had earlier about export controls, is to figure out how trade policies can affect and support the operation of global value chains in normal times and in crises. And the fifth area, which a new Director General I think should be working on, is, and this would support all the other 4 ideas I mentioned, is to strengthen the transparency and analytical functions of the Secretariat and to rebalance the organization in that direction, perhaps away from some of the other functions which are now somewhat in abeyance. All of these, of course, are ideas for the next 12 months, but they would all be, they could be complemented by progress in any one of the joint statement initiatives which are underway as well. So let me finish there, saying I do think we have a great opportunity to try and demonstrate the relevance of the WTO in the short term. We have to worry about medium-term scarring of the system, and we have to return to the fundamental question: what is this purpose of this organization? Because the status quo is intolerable. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Simon. Lots of food for thought there. I do detect 3 large clusters of issues that we have touched upon, and which I think have a lot to do with what we you're saying in terms of challenges for the future, the first cluster is all of the subsidies issues. Rufus mentioned state-owned enterprises, level playing field. And I guess this goes to the heart of the discussion on economic models that is very much there between China and the West, basically. The second cluster is technology, e-commerce, and data flows. And I think both Annabelle, well, the three of you, Rufus and Simon, mentioned e-commerce data flows being as one of those issues. And third, last but not least, the sort of society issues such as health and an environment that need to be addressed as well. I like what you say, Simon. How can we channel crisis response in a harmonized way? So big challenges for the future. But let me stop here and first ask Ambassador Graça Lima whether he has any initial comments. We will now have a few minutes for questions, comments, but let me first ask Ambassador Graça Lima. Alfredo, you need to unmute that. Sorry, Alfredo, you need to unmute.
I'm sorry, I was just saying that we don't have much time for the Q&A part of our seminar, so I'd rather let the discussion flow and listen to the questions and the comments by our speakers. I may say a few words when we at the end of the event. Thank you.
I do see one question from Otávio de Barros to Ambassador Iexá. How do you see the US trade policy in relation to Brazil under a Biden administration? There's a question to all panelists referring to globalization, whether it will go backwards or not. And I think this is something that Annabelle was touching upon. Why don't we take these two questions first? So US-Brazil relations, and then globalization, how does that go forward?
Do you want me to go first, Victor, or?
Yes, why don't you go first, Rufus,
yeah.
and then Annabelle and Simon. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, the question is an understandable one because, obviously there will be a lot of questions about exactly what kinds of relationships and alliances is a Biden administration going to push forcefully and emphasize. Each president comes along with different objectives and priorities, but I think it's pretty clear that what we had during the Trump administration was really a kind of a very aggressive playing of kind of favorites and least favorites in their trade relationship. First of all, he emphasized pure bilateralism without regard to rules or the multilateral system to a large extent, raised a lot of questions about the fundamental underpinnings of the WTO, which has actually helped form the basis of our free trade agreements and bilateral agreements, principles like national treatment and MFN and other things. But I think clearly the Biden administration is going to go back to a more even-handed approach. I think they're going to obviously deal individually with other countries based on what are the frictions and problems between us and what is the composition of trade between us. And for those of us who've been involved in US-Brazil bilateral relations for a long time, historically, we found a lot of common purpose, for example, on agricultural reform in the WTO system, but also had frictions between our agriculture sectors where they competed. And we had worked with Brazil in a number of areas, and also had some frictions with Brazil in some of the new areas of the global economy. When I think back, for example, to the Uruguay round. But I think the Biden administration approach is going to be, first of all, I think they want greater stability. I think they want to make have more friendly relations, but also blunt relations where there are problems. So I think that has yet to be defined. I don't see him immediately traveling down to Brasilia to sort of, buddy up to Bolsonaro. I think he's going to have a whole different, more even-handed approach. I think he's put a lot of emphasis on, reducing some of the irritants that have been created in our trade, for example, with Europe. So that may be an early area of focus. And then, of course, a big focus on developing a more coherent, comprehensive China strategy. But I think at the same time, not leaving out other important bilateral relationships. And I think the underpinnings of it will be seeking as much stability as possible, and resolving disputes in a sort of a collaborative way. I wanted to just say one thing quickly, going back on the excellent presentations by Annabelle and Simon, and so much talk and emphasis about issues like COVID and trade, the trade impacts in the future, and the role of the trading system in dealing with many of these pressures for restrictive trade. And I liked a lot of what they both had to say there. I've thought about different ideas that the WTO ought to be moving towards in a post-pandemic era. And one of them, obviously a lot of what Simon said, the scarring in the system that is not self-correcting, that we need to go back and work on. Clearly, it won't be relevant unless we're dealing with the digital economy. And we all know that we're going to have to work on what he called, I think, a reduced carbon economy. And, clearly the relationship between trade and climate change and environmental sustainability are going to be important. But in the whole area of health, I think it would be really helpful to have greater cooperation between the WTO and the WHO and other organizations and national governments on how you create better certainty for future pandemics, in whether that's agreements on how governments trade and stockpile protective clothing or ventilators, how they would work to ensure equitable distribution of vaccines, just a whole host of areas where, I could see coherence between international organizations as being an important element of this. I know there's a lot of, as Simon has said, there's a lot of things that the WTO needs to get moving in order to be relevant. When I think back to the old bicycle theories of the GATT that we used to talk about all the time in the old GATT days, and Alfredo will remember that very well. I think that still applies today. If we can't move the system forward with, boldly moving into these different areas, and public health and the environment are clearly in that category, as is the digital economy, the WTO is going to continue to lapse into irrelevance. And the best way to get it more relevant, so people are willing to actually have a stake in it and live with a binding dispute system, is to move it forward in some of these difficult areas. And it's going to take a lot of collaboration between governments to have an intelligent discussion of these things, so that we move towards really meaningful practical outcomes rather than just political outcomes.
Thank you very much, Rufus. On deglobalization or reglobalization, do you want to take a crack at that, Annabelle?
Thank you very much, Victor. Let me just say a couple of words on that. I think that we have been discussing, whether globalization will be over, at least since the global financial crisis, right? And each time there's a major shock to the global economy, there is this important question: well, what will happen to globalization? But I think that we had the global financial crisis when the confrontations between China and the U.S. Moved to a different dimension under the current administration. We also asked, well, will globalization be able to survive geopolitical competition and the trade confrontations? And now, of course, with the massive shock of COVID-19, it's the most appropriate question. My sense is that globalization will will continue to be with us, but will continue to change and evolve, and driven by COVID-related factors, but also by other elements such as technology, for sure, by policies adopted by governments, for sure, by the sustainability imperative, if you wish. So all of these forces will change globalization. So maybe it will not be, anchored in merchandise trade, but maybe it once we're able to come back to our full normal lives, then services will, grow back again, and the digital economy will be increasingly more relevant. As we move, after the pandemic, I think that a big concern is the world ready to tackle the sustainability challenges seriously? So that will sure have an impact on globalization as well. So globalization will continue to evolve, but the question to me is more, what kind of policies are conducive for globalization to evolve in a way that can become more sustainable, that can become more inclusive, and that can serve, humanity in a way as we would all like to see it. And there, I think, it's very much in the hands of policymakers, and it goes to this point about why it's so important to have global cooperation at the multilateral level, because this can certainly have an impact. And I think, going to the point that Simon was saying, if the WTO has nothing to say in the area of digital trade, well, it's missing in action, right? Will it remain sort of like the WTO of the era of only trading goods and by ship? That's not the kind of organization that we need to be able to underpin the globalization of the future, right?
Thank you very much, Annabelle. On that, I'm pleased to say, that I'm under my unit, we assist members in the e-commerce joint initiative statement, and just today, the three co-conveners, Singapore, Australia, and Japan, circulated a draft consolidated text for what could be an e-commerce agreement. So watch that space. It's interesting going there. Let me turn to Simon if you want to add anything on globalization, but there's an interesting question here from Rodrigo Pupo, who's a lawyer in Sao Paulo, a good friend, asking about unilateral actions taken by countries to encourage the adoption of sustainable production and consumption standards. I think that's an indirect reference to border tax adjustments and that sort of thing. Any views on that? And feel free to add on globalization. Simon, over to you.
So I'll try and combine them in my answer, which is, if we take trade in goods, fortunately, we have not seen many countries up until now raising tariffs across the board, with the notable exception of Saudi Arabia this year. If you take them out of this, most countries have not done anything like that this year. And so what we have then is a trade in goods, which is, I think, nominally open, but increasingly distorted by subsidies. And so what we have is what I would call a sort of bastardized form of globalization, open but thoroughly distorted. And that's, I think, the distinction which is critical to make. In the area of digital trade and the like, we are seeing more barriers to cross-border data transfer, the ability to service markets abroad and the like. So if I was to worry about sort of border barriers, in inverted commas, then I would look very much in that area. And that's one of the reasons why we need to make progress in that area. Now, you asked about these policies to encourage more sustainable trade and border tax adjustments. And this, if managed poorly, could indeed reintroduce substantial barriers to cross-border trade in goods, and we could go backwards in time there. And that's an area which really has to receive a lot of very careful thought if we're going to be able to implement climate change-based initiatives without destroying some of the key principles. Of course, what's happening at the moment is, in the absence of border tax adjustments, we have countries some governments trying to raise the price of carbon, and this is making less competitive their energy-intensive industries. And the reaction of those governments has often been to offer subsidies through the back door, often in terms of free emissions trading permits. And so what we have is, in the absence of border tax adjustments, we have pressures to raise the price of carbon, which are then triggering a subsidy problem. In short, this area is a mess, and it really does need some very serious thought in the next 3 to 5 years. We really have got to get to grips with this particular problem, because the unilateral measures that countries are taking, even if they don't resort to border tax adjustments, are going to be building up quite serious trade policy problems. So again, this is another reason why the moves towards a transition to a low carbon economy is an item which really has to receive a lot more attention in Geneva and from trade policy experts.
Thank you very much, Simon. We have a question from dear friend Antonio da Costa Silva. He's the Brazilian ambassador to San Jose in Costa Rica. I'm very happy that Ambassador Costa Silva is here with us. And he's asking, to what extent would the Biden administration, and I guess this is something that you could take up, Rufus, but Simon and Annabelle, feel free as well. To what extent a Biden priority on COVID opens up space for pushing a trade agenda related to health and health services? A trade agenda on health and health services, I should say, that is already very much in the radar here in Geneva. But do you think a Biden administration would tackle that, Rufus?
I think there will clearly be a significant health-related plank in any trade policy, because it's even more pronounced now than it was before that this is critical. Well, whereas there are a lot of aspects of health policy which are purely domestic, like your healthcare and insurance system, there are clearly all these global issues, and there have been for some time, whether we talk about the TRIPS aspect of drugs, or look at the collaboration it took globally to create these new vaccines, and the collaboration in areas like research and development. But also, governments have a choice to make about how they deal with pandemics in the future. And I think Simon would agree with me that if you look at the initial reactions a lot of countries had, it was probably to, immediately race towards kind of, in a way, self-defeating export type measures, because of the panic that they weren't going to have enough access to these things, and that there was a lot of pressures created by open trade that governments didn't necessarily have a handle on. And so to me, there's a huge opportunity there to create greater certainty, predictability, and stability for the future. Now, what the details of that are, I can't say I know very well, but I do think that it will be a natural add-on to the domestic agenda on COVID. Although, let's all be realistic, the first priority most governments are focusing on is how do we get our own population vaccinated as quickly as possible. And the countries, unfortunately, we live in an unfair world, and the countries which have greater production capacity and that have companies that have produced these things are going to be able to do it more quickly, and maybe introduce some distortions in trade on the way, unfortunately. I'm thinking, longer term, do we have a chance to do better in the next pandemic?
Thank you very much, Rufus. I am looking at the time now. It's past 10 o'clock here in Geneva, a bit earlier for Annabelle and for Rufus and José Alfredo. I'm just checking whether there are any other questions. If not, let me turn to Ambassador Graça Lima, maybe for some final words. Again, on my side, to thank Rufus, Annabelle, and Simon for their participation. Really much appreciated. Let me take this opportunity also to thank colleagues in the support in CEBRI, Luciana, Nana, Eduardo, for your great work. So thank you very much for your support in Rio. Zalfredo, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you, Victor. And on behalf of CEBRI, I wish to reiterate my utmost appreciation for the work that has been done this afternoon or this evening in Geneva by brilliant presentations, explanations, insights that really make us understand a little bit more what is going on in trade. Trade is a passion for all of us who are gathered here. It has always been, and it's something that in which we really believe as a sort of way to redeem the economies in times of crisis, which is precisely what we are living now. I remember when Rufus was in one of his interventions in a council in GATT, he was saying that every 4 years there's a revolution in the United States. You remember that, and the revolution that we see now is not only in the United States, but it's been around in all the world, calling for solidarity, calling for the need to protect lives and use trade as a means to tackle this pandemic. We tend to forget that in the 80s or in the whole period before after the UI round was launched and before it was successfully concluded, there was an enormous crisis, an enormous economic crisis, of course, but it helped and impelled the whole community of nations to get together and make a strong effort, and the results are visible today. If the Uruguay round had not been concluded, we would be in a very poor situation from then on. It is incumbent on the economic agents to push forward to redress situations and to achieve this most important objective. Of course, the free trade has always been an utopia, but more trade is an achievable objective. And if we take the lessons from the past and the lessons that we have been learning along this year, I should call it the year of living dangerously, 2020, then we can all hope for a better future. I thank you from the bottom of my heart for your contribution as members of think tanks, as commissions, people who can make the difference in speaking truth to power. Telling them what their options are, the measures that have to be taken in order for us to come out safely and even more. More wealthier in the future. Thank you again, and you have a great weekend.